Hello, everybody. It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. Of course, you can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver every Wednesday, but Mondays, those are reserved for me to talk about monster movies. This week's feature is from writer and director Larry Cohen. Larry's kind of an interesting guy. His start was doing TV shows. But when he started making feature-length movies, he started in the blaxploitation genre with Bone, Black Caesar, and Hell Up in Harlem. He transitioned to horror with It's Alive, about a killer baby creature thing that got born. Most of his stuff was hardly just horror, though, as seen with today's featured flick, cue The Winged Serpent from 1982. Cohen passed away in March of this year, and while this was recently covered on The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs in the second week of the first 9-week season of his show, this is a movie that I particularly like for its interesting mix of genres. More on that later. Also, I'll be talking about the cast itself. This features a real powerhouse set of characters. You've got the lead, played by Michael Moriarty. He's playing kind of a loser crook. Candy Clark is playing his girlfriend, and she was actually nominated for an Academy Award for American Graffiti. And you also have great character actors David Carradine and Richard Roundtree playing cops that are kind of trying to solve this mystery around New York City. It's such an odd collection of characters for what essentially amounts to a monster movie, but it uses them well and even uses the setting of New York City about as well as it could ever be as a character itself. The movie begins with a window washer outside a pretty girl's office window. It's a brilliant little two-sided scene, if you ask me. From outside, the guy is professing his love for her. Inside, the girl is just talking about how creepy and annoying he is, that he cleans the window every damn day, it seems like. Just when she is basically telling him off from the inside, he's pulled up and then slams against the window without his head. It's an odd death to be sure, but it's New York, am I right? This is a great way to start the movie and to kind of start the whole thing with basically having a monster rampaging through the city. We then get a scene where we meet Quinn, which is Moriarty's character, who is learning about a job he's going to help pull with some other wise guys. That then transitions to Detective Shepard, which is David Carradine's character, and Sergeant Powell, who is Richard Roundtree, answering a call at a hotel where a body is found flayed. He's completely skinless and has been completely and totally I think they initially say, well, he was skinned, but then somebody corrected them and said, actually, I think that term is flayed. It's kind of a gruesome crime scene and really kind of interesting because this isn't a monster that's doing this inside of a hotel. This is a different crime, it seems like. After that, we see a guy peeping on a topless sunbather who's sunbathing on top of her building in New York City. And something seems to be circling around the building before swooping in and flying off with her, dripping her blood on all of the people on the street below. So we've got a series of strange deaths happening all over the city. That same day, Quinn goes to the bar his girlfriend, Joan, who's Candy Clark, works at, and tries to get a gig as a jazz pianist. That's really what he always wanted to be, but we find out through the course of the movie, he's just an utter loser who's just had maybe a series of bad luck, but also a series of doing things to himself that really kind of make him this really kind of scummy loser guy. I wouldn't even say that he's a likable loser, but he is the reason why this movie is so interesting and so good to watch. Here's where we get to see some of Moriarty's Quinn just chewing the scenery in a way that only Michael Moriarty can, particularly with a Larry Cohen character. Being a complete weirdo who can't stop scat singing while he's playing the piano, he does not get the gig whatsoever. So it's back to his day job as a thief pulling a diamond heist with these wise guys. Of course, that heist goes horribly wrong, too. Soon, through a series of events while trying to elude the Fuzz and some other people, Quinn ends up in the spire that sits atop the Chrysler building where he finds an odd nest with a giant egg in it. He also finds a skeleton of the nude sunbather from earlier in the movie. What I like about this scene is that it's already one thing to find a monster's nest, but that he somehow kind of casually got to the spire of the Chrysler building with little effort. I don't feel like that's something that you can really get into very easily, even in 1982. On top of that, finding that giant egg doesn't seem to faze him that much. The dead body, it's a little more of a surprise than anything, I guess, but I'm not convinced that he's all that bothered by that either. It's kind of a fascinating set of characters that we're dealing with here. Anyway, after a construction worker is attacked by the creature, Shepard is interviewing an expert in Aztec sacrificial ritual where he learns about the flaying being done to appease Quetzalcoatl. That's the Winged Serpent of the Aztec hierarchy of gods. What is a little more interesting to Shepard is that the guy who was flayed was from out of town. So it was some guy who had a good life, good job, a family, all of that, who came thousands of miles to New York to essentially be sacrificed for Quetzalcoatl. Even more oddly, Shepard kind of just buys into that A, someone thinks this is an Aztec god, and B, it's just a monster that he can hunt and kill. Sure, that makes sense. All right, so before we get to where things really start to converge, let's go back to Quinn, who gets to Joan's place after leaving the Chrysler building. He treats Joan like utter shit. He wants a drink. He demands that she get him a drink. She's not so sure that he should drink because he's not a nice drunk. He oftentimes beats her up when he's drunk. He has a complete breakdown with her because he is a total loser. They cannot drive this point home more, that he is an unlikable scumbag. He can't hardly explain what it was that he saw in the spire with the dead body and the giant egg, which he hasn't mentioned at all at this point. He's a former junkie and alcoholic. He's just a total mess. He finally talks about the egg, but he sounds like a total maniac. This is what I talked about earlier, where this movie totally mixes genre with this being more of a character study of a scumbag just looking for a break, but he's also he's just such a loser that with all of his addictions and so forth, you can't really take him seriously for anything. Anyway, Powell becomes suspect of the Aztec expert that Shepard talked to earlier, so the cops are going to lean pretty hard on pretty much everyone in the anthropology department at the university. Quinn continues to investigate, though, and in the other side of the movie, Quinn is getting pressure from the wise guys that he pulled that diamond heist with. He lost the diamonds in the confusion after the heist and before he got into the Chrysler building. He tells the wise guys that the diamonds are there in the spire, and he takes them up there, and Q gets a meal out of these two guys. So here's where we get to the real plan of the movie when it comes to Quinn's character. The cops need to find this thing that's killing people, and Quinn has knowledge of where it sleeps and where it hangs out. Quinn also needs to do something with his life and is basically being pinched by the cops for having gone into the spire earlier and having been seen with these wise guys, these known wise guys. So he decides to make a deal, basically saying, I'll take you to the creature, but I get a pardon, and I get a pretty fat reward out of this. He does basically get what he wants, but when he leads him to the nest, Shepard only kills the baby inside this egg. This royally pisses off the full-grown Q, which we find out later. But this also negates the $1 million that Quinn negotiated for, which causes him to flip out because he figured as long as they knew where the nest was, he was doing his part of the bargain. But I guess not. The deal was specifically signed to find the creature, not the nest. Meanwhile, Powell goes to arrest the people doing the Aztec sacrifices, but is ultimately killed by the serpent. Shepard does eventually face off against the full-grown Q and kills it. And meanwhile, one of the sacrifice guys gets to Quinn and is planning to kill him to bring Q back. Shepard comes to save Quinn. And what's great about that is that what gives Shepard the time to find Quinn is that Quinn refuses at knife point to speak a prayer for the sacrifice because he basically says he ain't going to say the fucking prayer, so just kill him. It's actually kind of funny how it plays out. While Quinn may not have his reward, he's kind of determined to get his life together and get back to playing piano after this is all over with and make everything work out. So I guess that's a pretty good conclusion for everyone except for Shaft, who got the shaft by being eaten by a giant monster bird. The movie ends, though, with a second egg in another building that hatches and unleashes a new baby Q. So the end, question mark? I don't know. Let's get to the three things that I like about this movie. As kind of a bonus, I just want to say that I love movies that take place in New York City during the 70s and 80s. There's a certain scum to it that is almost romanticized. There's a near post-apocalyptic feel to it, with every street looking grimy or even at worst, just piles of trash everywhere. I just love movies that are set in New York during this time. Of course, Giuliani had to go in there and fuck it all up by cleaning up the city or whatever. But I personally like watching these movies where New York kind of plays that scuzzy, kind of dirty world like it does in this movie. So for likes number 1 and 2, I have to go with Michael Moriarty and David Carradine. On one hand, this is absolutely Moriarty's movie. I don't know how much of what he says is scripted, but it's almost impossible to find any more of a realized character in any movie ever. Moriarty's Quinn looks like a guy they picked up in jail and put in this movie. He talks like an asshole. He acts like an asshole. And on the other side of it is Carradine. And he's much more reserved compared to Moriarty, but he's also spot on. While he's always kind of had a weird lifestyle with various offenses on his police record and so forth, this isn't long before Carradine would start doing movies to basically live paycheck to paycheck, or so it seemed. I don't know if it's Cohen or who he was working with or what, but it seemed like Carradine was all in on this movie. The scenes with the two of them together are just simply marvelous. The third thing I like about this movie is the fact that this is a monster movie about a giant mythical bird taking place in modern day New York City. Who was making monster movies like this in the 1980s? Well, Larry Cohen was. Who was making monster movies in the 80s and making them in a way that was played seriously and not campy? Larry Cohen was. This movie takes itself very seriously, but still mixes in a police procedural with a character study of a loser crook mixed with a giant Aztec monster bird eating people, sunbathing nude on top of buildings, or leering at pretty professional women while washing windows. You could think of this, you would think that this would get laughs in theaters as it played. But if you watch the movie, it's engaging and really kind of interesting for really what it is. Finally, speaking of Larry Cohen and his movies, he later made a movie with Michael Moriarty, no less, that was called The Stuff. If you think back to last week's Monster Mondays, I covered The Blob. Well, The Stuff is kind of like The Blob in the sense that you have this goopy, gooey stuff coming along and attacking people. The Stuff diverges a bit, making it a little bit more like an Invasion of the Body Snatchers type of thing, but I have to figure it wasn't totally without some influence from The Blob. I just find it interesting that I decided to put The Blob and Larry Cohen next to each other on the schedule. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and new installments of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com. You can also check out my post at my website, bmovieanima.com, each and every Friday morning.